Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Elisabeth Davis, and in this video I'm going to go over how to evaluate sources. When I've worked with first semester students before, they tend to go, oh, well, here's a source, obviously I can trust it. Yeah, no, that's not always the case. When we look at different sources, we have to think critically about them. So we have to think about, is it relevant to what we're talking about? Who is the author of the source? And we have to really kind of delve into their background. We have to think about the purpose of the source. And then when we're looking at secondary sources, we have to make sure that there are citations and the citations are manageable. So don't worry, I'm going to go over all of this in a minute. So let's start off with, is the source relevant? So it's really easy to go onto Google, or it's easy to go onto one of the library databases and just kind of search for a term. And what comes up may not often be what we're talking about. So the example I gave here is, if I'm studying the American Revolution, I want sources that are about or come from the time period of the American Revolution. So if I'm looking at primary sources, I want my primary sources to come from the time of the War for Independence. I don't want a primary source that comes from the 1900s. Now, if I'm looking at a secondary source, remember, a secondary source analyzes the past. I want it to analyze the time frame of the American Revolution. I don't want it to analyze the 1900s. So the first thing we have to think about with our sources are they relevant to what we're studying? So another example I want to give is, in my U.S. history courses, I often assign a mini research project where students have to take a film and they have to put it into historical context. So if they are looking at a movie that's made in the 1970s, they need to look at the 1970s in general and see what's going on in the 1970s. So if you're looking for a secondary source, I need it to be about America in the 1970s, not America in like the 1940s. That's what we mean by relevant. Is the source you're looking at relevant to the topic you're talking about? The next thing we need to think about is, who is the author? What is their background? What is their perspective? And why are they writing this source? So when we create things, our backgrounds, who we are, influence that. This can be how we are raised. This can be our religious values, our political values. This can be our education background. This can be where we live in the country. This can be where we've moved to. This can be our social economic background. This can be whether we have traveled or not. But all of this influences the source we look at. And these influences, these perspectives, become our biases. Now, often people hear the term bias and they freak out. They're like, oh my gosh, a bias, that's a bad thing. Oh! No, it's not. A bias is neither a good thing or a bad thing. It just is. It is the author's perspective. It is their background and how it influences the source that they are creating. So, for example, my research is in the field of women's history and religious history, and I typically do research in the 19th century going into the early 20th century. Most of my research is on Catholicism. I'm not Catholic. My husband's Jewish, my mother's Episcopalian. I'm not Catholic. I study the history of Catholicism, and I study the history of women from a social cultural standpoint. I don't look too much at religious rituals. Well, that's my bias. That is how my background influences how I do my research. It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing. It's just how it is. Every source we look at has a bias. It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing. It is literally just how it is. So when we're looking at sources, we have to take into account the author's bias. What is their perspective? How does their background, their worldview shape the source they're writing? Moreover, why are they writing this source? What is the purpose of this source? So people often say that there are 3 reasons there are three purposes in any source. The first purpose is to inform you about something, so to tell you what, when, why, where. The second thing is to persuade you about something, try to get you to think differently. And the third is to entertain you. Okay, well, students tend to say, well, if the purpose of a source is to inform you, obviously it is something it's obviously factual, we can obviously trust it. Nope. Facts and figures lie. Facts and figures lie. Even when the purpose is to inform, we have to go back to the author's background. Why actually are they trying to inform you of something? Because there's always going to be a purpose. There's a hidden agenda. So an example I want to give to you guys comes from a couple of years ago. I went to Walmart and I was buying bagels. And I don't know why. I was just like, I'm going to read the back of the bagels. I never do this, but I decided to read the back of the bagels. And at the very bottom, in bold letters, it said, product may cause cancer. Like, what? What? Like, I eat bagels regularly. Like, what are you talking about? This product may cause cancer. And so I go in and I'm looking at them like, what are you talking about? And at the underneath this big bold print, it says, for more information, see here. And so I'm standing in the store and I pull out my phone and I start looking this up. Well, I did a lot of searching on this. The product may cause cancer if you burn your bagel. I'm not talking like a little bit burn. I'm talking about charring your bagel so it's black on top. For me, that's inedible. So you char your bagel and then you eat it like that for 20 years. And that may cause cancer. So the purpose of this informative thing on the bottom was to say, you may get cancer from eating this. That is to inform. But that didn't give me all the information. The reality was that if you burn your bagel to a crisp and ate it that way for 20 years, then you might possibly get cancer. So even when we have things that are there to inform us, we have to think about, okay, what was the purpose? Why did the author pick the facts and figures they did? Why did they choose things? Because in reality, that thing at the bottom, that wasn't there to inform. And when I went through this even further and found the author who had made it, who had been like, hey, you have to put this in, there's a political reason for it. And I had to go digging to find why this was on there, and then I found it. So it presented as, I'm informing you, as a public health announcement, you might get cancer from eating this bagel. In reality, when I went digging and looked at the author of this public service announcement, there's a political purpose. So even when a source says it is there to inform you, no, it's not. So we have to go back and look at the author's background. Always, 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 and forever. So an example of this, of evaluating a source that I want to give, is this very, very famous piece of history written by Thomas Jefferson. I'm a little irreverent, I call him Tommy J. And it goes, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth, and to separate an equal station to which the laws of nature and God, nature's God entitled them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. I've read this so many times, I still can't get it out. Okay. This should sound familiar, though, despite my stumbling. It's the Declaration of Independence. So, I've had students in the past read this and like, yes, Dr. Davis, everyone in the colonies wanted to be free from the British. And that's what Thomas Jefferson wants you to believe. But in looking at his background, we can see, not the case. So, Thomas Jefferson was an educated man from Virginia. And in being educated, he really was inspired by the ideals of the Enlightenment era. Now, the Enlightenment has a couple big themes. It talks about how man is rational. It says that the government should be responsible to the people. And it says that if the government doesn't fulfill its duties to the people have the right to react. And that reaction could be overthrowing the government. Who knows? So Thomas Jefferson is influenced by the Enlightenment. He loves the Enlightenment. Moreover, Thomas Jefferson is a radical. He's living in Virginia at a moment where most Virginians don't want to leave Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson writes this, and most Virginians are like, dude, what were you talking about? Like, we're not unanimous in this. He's a radical. So his background is that of an educated man. He presents as wealthy, but in reality, like most plantation owners, he wasn't that wealthy. He kept borrowing a lot of money. And his perspective, his bias is the Enlightenment's right. There's something wrong with our relationship with Great Britain. And the purpose of this source is to convince Great Britain that it's time for the US, for what will become the US, to leave, using Enlightenment ideals. So this is a piece of propaganda. First off, it says, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. This was not at all unanimous. When we look at the background, once the Declaration of Independence is signed, America kind of goes into a civil war. And Virginia especially is in the midst of a civil war where many people wanted to remain loyal to the British. So Jefferson's like, oh yeah, we are totally all together in this. Purpose, propaganda. Next off, we see him being inspired by the Enlightenment. He says the laws of nature and God's men entitle them a decent, the separate and equal status. That's Enlightenment ideals. He says about people should declare the causes which impel them to the separation from their mother colony, i.e., the British and the Americans are no longer one country. That's an Enlightenment ideal. He's using the Enlightenment to drive his message. Now, most people who fought for the American Revolution, would they have actually said this? Probably not. It would have been just like, British are bad, our taxes are too high. Jefferson, because he's coming from this very intellectual standpoint, is saying, no, the reason for this is because of the Enlightenment. And that's driving the source. He's also using propaganda in order to promote these ideas. And that's very, very important. So rather than just reading the source and being like, yes, all people in the colonies wanted to rebel, when we read it, we're like, wait a minute. This was A, a piece of propaganda, because most people didn't want to rebel. And B, if most people had read this, they honestly wouldn't have known what Jefferson was talking about because he's coming from a very intellectual perspective. So moving on, and I want to focus in a bit more on secondary sources. Everything we've been talking about applies to secondary sources, but we're going to add in something else. So when looking at a secondary source, such as something from Encyclopedia Britannica or an academic article, we're going to look at the author's background. But we have to be a little bit more critical. We want to think about, is the author an expert in the field? So as I said earlier, my research is in women's history and religious history in the 19th century, so the 1800s and early 1900s. Well, let's say I suddenly decide I'm going to write a history on China, and I get it published. Should you trust me as much as somebody who actually has a PhD in Chinese history? You probably shouldn't. I might be able to get it published, it might be well researched, but you still shouldn't trust me as much as an expert in the field. So we really want to look to see if somebody is an expert in what they're talking about with a secondary source. Because if we're going to be getting our information from there, we want to make sure that they've actually done the research on it. We want to make sure, what is the purpose of the source? Most secondary sources are there to inform you. But when we look at academic sources, they're also there to persuade you of something. And when we look at that persuasion, we need to make sure that there are citations. Now, citations can be broadly defined. So if I'm looking at an academic article, I want to see lots and lots of citations. Versus if I'm looking at a website, what counts as a citation might be a little different. It could be a hyperlink where I click on it and it takes me to another source. Well, at least I know where they're getting their sources. And that's really important. Now, in my classes, there are two sources that are banned. First off is history.com. It used to be history.com and the History Channel were there to give you an education. That's what their purpose was. And they actually used experts in the field, which was really awesome. Well, history.com is kind of only there for entertainment purposes. Open. So if I click on their main page, what I get from their main page is just like entertainment stuff that really doesn't have much to do with history. Moreover, when they do have documentaries and pages that are actually on history, often their so-called experts are people who have kind of been fired in the history profession. Every so often I will watch a history.com documentary just to see what the quality is, because I remember when it was a really, really great resource. And I'm honestly astonished by going, wait a minute, I know that name. And I know that name because they were fired for making stuff up. So history.com is just, it's not a reputable source. Another banned source is Wikipedia. So first off, Wikipedia is crowdsourced, so anyone can go on to Wikipedia and add things. Now, Wikipedia does require you to add citations when you add things, but you can literally add google.com and it will accept it as a citation. A lot of the citations you can add on Wikipedia too are also behind paywalls, which is kind of like suspicious because you can't actually see what it's being said. So someone can just make something up, put the citation in, and you can't fact check it. Wikipedia is kind of hit or miss about when it enforces citations. So this is a Wikipedia page for the MCU because I had to try and connect with y'all. And also, I love the MCU. So on the MCU, when I'm looking at the first paragraphs, paragraph 1, no citations. 2, we have hyperlinks, but it's not fully a citation. 3, 4, no citations. I don't see citations until much later. And in Wikipedia, these are what they count as citations, not so much the hyperlinks. Some of the hyperlinks are sort of citations, but not fully. But Wikipedia it's just not, it's crowdsourced. So anyone can write anything, and some of the articles are fact-checked, others aren't. So it's just not a reputable source. Luckily, I have other videos for you and other guides on how to find reputable secondary sources. Okay, so I know that was a lot. So to review, when we look at any type of information, we have to think critically about it. We can't just go, oh yes, totally, I believe it. No, we have to think about the author's background, why the source was even made. When we look at secondary sources, we have to go into whether there are citations or not. And we can't just do this with primary sources, we have to do this with secondary sources as well. So you're going to complete the learning activity online, and then you will get an awesome, super duper completion code so you can do your Blackboard activity. Let me know if you have any questions.